Given the recent pandemic, most companies have re-evaluated their supply chains with an emphasis on reducing risk and increasing resilience. Today's guest, Knut Alicke, has written extensively on these issues, as well as supply chain leadership in his new book, From Source to Sold. Knut, welcome to Lokad.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Well, I said welcome to Lokad. It's probably more accurate to say welcome back to Lokad. You were with us, I think, 3 years ago, almost to the day, in fact. That's correct. So it's your second episode with us?
So it was 3 years ago, you're right. We talked about something like the future of the supply chain work, skills, and everything. Yep. It has been an interesting 3 years for all of us, with a lot of disruptions and a lot of things going on in supply chain.
Well, absolutely, and we'll get back into that. But for anyone who might have missed that episode, I'm sure one or two people did, could you maybe reintroduce yourself to the audience, please?
Sure. So my name is Knut Alicke. I'm working for McKinsey. I'm based out of our Stuttgart office in Germany, and supply chain is my passion. So that's what I do since almost 30 years. So next year it becomes 30 years. So we are getting older and older. And what I do here is basically all topics in terms of planning, so forecasting, s&op, supply planning, production planning, inventory, but then also physical flow, warehouse optimization, transport network optimization, to set the right governance, organizational structure. And over the last 3 years, clearly working on supply chain risk and resilience to help our clients to be better and to have a more resilient supply chain. And next to McKinsey, I'm still teaching. So I'm developing, so to say, the new class and the new crowd of supply chain professionals, because that's what we always hear, that we don't have enough supply chain professionals. We don't have enough people who really understand end-to-end, who understand trade-offs, and who are into the topic.
Well, actually, if we can just then go back to what we were discussing, because you mentioned, again, it was 3 years ago, we talked about, well, not me, but with Joannes, you talked about the future of supply chain and the skills required. And that was mid-pandemic. In the years that have followed, now we're basically post-pandemic, do you think that the situation has changed? Risk and resilience have become more of an issue. So is it the same skill set required, or has that changed?
So a lot happened. If we just look back 3 years, a lot of companies started, kind of after the first lockdown, started to set up firefighting war rooms, control rooms, whatever they called it, and to solve problems. That was not always done in a systematic way. That was not always done in kind of really thinking about end to end. And then they realized that, hey, we need to do more, right? We need to prepare. We need to make sure that we have the right visibility in place. We need to have the right levers in place that we can pull. And we need to make sure that our planning processes are, I would say, agile enough and fast enough. So a lot of companies did reduce their planning from a monthly planning to every 2 weeks. And in the S&OE, so the operational planning, from a week to whatever, every 2 days. And that all requires talent. That requires talent that understands supply chain, that understands digital, and brings everything together. And what we see here is there is still a huge gap. The gap got smaller. People did, I would say, educate their own staff. There was a lot of hiring going on from external, but still there is a gap in terms of experience in supply chain, how to best use digital tools to plan and to improve the performance of the supply chain.
Well, thank you, Joannes. You were on that panel as well. I mean, have you changed at all your perspective in the intervening years?
Evolved, yes. I don't know. To what degree it counts as change, but the gist of it is, from my perspective, is that the more disruption you face, the more automation you need. Because you see, if your routine is already keeping everybody busy, firefighting and dealing with the mundane. If you're already at 100% busy just coping with the mundane, when the extraordinary hits you, then you have like zero leeway into coping with this extra stuff. And I don't mean in supply chain capacity or hard assets, but just the mental bandwidth to deal with the problem. If everybody in the organization is already at full speed just to keep the just to operate the company on a normal day, when you have like an abnormal day, then everything kind of explodes or get delayed. And I don't have, I would say, a silver bullet to free up this bandwidth. However, one of the, I would say, next best alternative to a silver bullet is extensive software automation, so that at least all the mundane decisions and mundane stuff gets out of the way, robotized. And so people have the time to focus on what is fairly unusual. And by unusual, I don't mean, the usual fluctuations of the demand being a little bit higher, a little bit lower, or lead times similarly varying. I mean, structural change where you have suppliers that disappear, suppliers that goes way more expensive with no going back to the earlier state of affairs, tariff, or things that really modify the structure of the market in which you operate.
Well, it occurs to me in a discussion on risk and resilience, it probably would be better to actually define the term. So Knut, if I can come back to you. Again, post-pandemic people talk about the importance of risk and resilience, but I mean risk and resilience existed pre-pandemic. So in your expert opinion, how exactly have these concepts changed, like materially? How have they changed as a result of the pandemic?
The good question is whether anything changed. If you think about, like, what was it, 2011, when we had Fukushima, that was like 12 years ago. And companies reacted in a way, they also reacted to the recent shutdowns, disruptions, and lockdowns. So I would say that a lot of the ideas did exist many, many years ago, but they were not seen as important. Companies would not focus on that. They would say, hey, the problem, the disruption is over, let's go back to normal, and let's just make sure that our supply chain is, let's say, as lean as possible, as cheap as possible, but not as resilient as possible. So if you think about what is necessary to be resilient, we need to have the visibility in place. So we need to have something like a pre-warning system that, hey, something is cooking in, let's say, tier 3, tier 4. So not our direct supplier, but the supplier of the supplier of the supplier has some problems. Maybe there's a logistics issue. Maybe there's a production issue. Maybe there is a quality issue. We know exactly that this will kind of manage all the way down to us, to our production line, and will cause a disruption. If we know that early enough, we can react, or let's say hope we can react. To be able to react, we also need to make sure that we have something like scenario planning in place. So if we, for example, then see that, oh, this container will probably arrive 2 weeks late, then this information itself is not helpful. The information that this 2 weeks delay leads to a stock out in our components, that leads to a production stoppage because we cannot assemble whatever we want to assemble, or we have an availability issue with this. We cannot kind of deliver to the retail store that desperately need our products. This is very important. And for that, we need scenario planning. So we need to analyze what is it that we can implement to mitigate these delay. Is it that we need to expedite the shipment? Is it that we substitute the product? Is it that we need to fly in something else to make up for the delay? And this is where a lot of companies still have a problem that, hey, we create one plan, but we are not able to create plans just in case a disruption happens or some delay happens. And this is super important. If you now think about what is necessary to do that, we need to have data in place, master data. We need to have the capabilities in place. We started to talk about this. And we need to have the organization in place that also accepts that here in this scenario, we come to the conclusion that air freight is the solution, and then we go for air freight. All of this needs to happen to make sure that we, so to say, have a resilient supply chain that is still able to deliver.
Well, actually, again, you've identified 3 ingredients, and that was something that you mentioned in a recent survey that you wrote at McKinsey on tech and regionalization. You mentioned the most resilient supply chains have end-to-end visibility, high-quality master data, and do effective demand scenario planning. So, Joannes, to turn it back to you, why do you think that those are absolutely critical ingredients to have for a resilient supply chain, or would you add anything else to that?
Yes, I mean from my perspective, for example, the challenge with data is very specific in the sense that data quality is usually excellent. That's weird. I know most vendors complain about bad data, but the reality is that when we look at, let's say, Western companies, maybe not Asian companies, but Western companies have been digitalized for 3 decades, and usually in terms of accuracy, when there is a record, say this thing has been sold on this day, this quantity, it is 99.9% accurate. So yes, there are some clerical errors here and there, but it is very accurate. Now the problem is not that the data is usually incorrect, that the semantic is very, very fuzzy. Just to give an idea, most of our clients that are, and I'm thinking of the bigger ones, like public companies, usually it is very, very fuzzy to count what they have in stock. The problem is not that they don't have the data. The problem is that just imagine you don't have like 1 ERP, you have 20 ERPs. And they all count the stock not in one way, but in 20 different ways. And then the stock is not binary, it's there or not there. It can be on hold at the customs, it can be on hold for quality testing, it can be in storage, it can be reserved for some clients somewhere. It can be, so you see there are plenty of complexities. And then when you think about the same thing, I'm talking about the stock because it's something very, very basic. But then when you think about the demand, same thing. It becomes, when you start paying attention to the detail, it becomes very quickly very fuzzy in the sense that, let's consider, for example, a B2B distributor. So if you're selling to businesses. So usually you have like multiple order dates, not one. You have the dates where the clients tell you, I want this in the future, but it's not like a firm order. It's in the future. And then there will be a date when they pass the order, and then there will be a date when they want a portion of the order first delivered, and then another date for the second part of the order being delivered and whatnot. So you see, the sort of demand signal is not like a simple time series that you can go in the past and monitor. And so I would say I absolutely agree with this sort of end-to-end visibility. It is a critical ingredient. But where I think that companies are frequently lacking is that there is a lack of digital culture to apprehend the nuances that gets into this data. And so the problem is not so much that the data is bad or that they don't have the data. The problem is that they have literally thousands and thousands of tables, and people are drowning into, I would say, bad KPIs, simplistic recipes and whatnot that just do not tell them what they need to know. And one example would be for example, companies that operate multi-echelon supply chains that we have seen, people think about, let's say, service levels in the middle of the network. But the service level of the middle of the network tells you nothing about the perceived quality of service from the client side. It's pure artifacts. And I could go on and on. So yes, I think I would say those problems are the same, but you see, there is some twist in the way you look at them. And that's where I think that's the biggest, skill gap, is exactly how, when we talk about master data, what does that mean to have, is it master data or mastery of the data? That's kind of play of word, but I would be more on, the problem is more the mastery of the data rather than the lack of data or the lack of quality data.
So Knut, just to throw it back to you, do you agree that it's more a matter of actually how you interpret the data richness or the data source and not the intrinsic quality of the data itself?
Honestly, I saw both, but I would agree that use the data and create insights from the data is very, very important. Let me just add one element to this, because that is also what I see in many of our clients happening. And this is I would say the planner has a system to use, right? Using data. And then there is an algorithm, and that algorithm does some funky stuff. Calculates a forecast, calculates a production plan, supply plan, whatsoever. What we often see is there's much more, let's say, algorithmic intelligence in there than the planner is, I would say, ready to use. And why is that? That is because for most planners, the algorithm looks like a black box. What they would like to do is they would like to open the black box, look inside, understand, and then use it. So we did for a big pharmaceutical company, we did an analysis after they implemented one of the big planning systems. And there were only 8 people, they were logging in and using the system. All the other hundreds of planners were logging in, but then they logged out very fast, and then they logged in again, and then logged out. What does that mean? They downloaded all data to their Excel sheets. They did their usual changes and planning and uploaded the results again. So one very important element is explainability. We need to create trust in terms of all the algorithms we have. We either need to explain it, or we need to have other ways to show that the algorithms are working the way they should work. And with this only, the planners will finally use all this cool stuff that is out there.
Well, actually, a quick follow-up to that, and it's relevant to something I read actually at Lokad. I'm not going to say who wrote it, but it was in a paper on MRO, and they said that more important than understanding how the algorithm works, it's more important for the practitioner to understand what it is trying to do. And I'm curious, with what Knut's just said and what I've just said, what is your take on that, Joannes?
So I think I completely agree with Knut in the sense that sophisticated methods introduce another new classes of risk. And that is, and when you look at some of the biggest supply chains disaster of all time, they were software driven. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the Nike disaster of 2004, that's Target Canada, that's Lidl that wasted €500 million. So it's yeah, I mean, software let you do things at scale super fast, including super dumb things. And yes, and opacity, it doesn't take like anything that is like super fancy to get super opaque. I mean, that's the beauty of computers, is that the human mind, you know, is left behind, I would say, with only something like 10 multiplications, and then you know, even if you're like super smart, any you know, modest calculation that does more than 10 multiplication and additions, you can't intuitively follow up what is going on. So it doesn't take, you know, like brutal numerical sophistication to be absolutely opaque. Even something that is still relatively simple in terms of computer, I would say, processing power is already way beyond what you can follow. So here, I agree this is a big problem. And by the way, even if you replace planners by data scientists, you still get the exact same problem. It is that there are entire classes of machine learning tools that are very opaque, even to the people who wield those tools. So even if you have like I would say, a deep understanding of the algorithms, doesn't mean that you kind of understand if the results that you're looking at is really what you intended. That's another class of problem. So again, there is no, I would say, there is no easy solution to that. The way Lokad approached that is mostly by being very opinionated on certain classes of machine learning tools, especially differentiable programming, that lets you operate with semantic variables. So the idea is that it's not any kind of machine learning. It's the sort of models where every single variable has kind of a name and a semantic attached to it. So that means that you can inspect what is going on piecewise in your model to gain an understanding of whether the behavior looks correct. We can go into the detail, but just to give you an example, if, for example, we have cyclicities, day of the week, week of the year, week of the month, it means that those cyclicities are going to have like name parameters that you can check. There will be literally a variable called the Ramadan effect or the Chinese New Year effect. It may sound like very anti-machine learning because we don't auto-discover the patterns, but the idea that all the patterns are kind of named and so variables have like a clear semantic make it much easier to inspect piecewise the model. So even if the output is strange, you can still go and inspect the pieces that constitute the model, and it doesn't take like a PhD in mathematics to do that. So that's only part of the solution, but the rest is it needs also different methodologies, but that would go beyond the scope of that. Yeah. But yes, the technological risk. I mean, introducing sophistication in trying to make your company more resilient. I would say the history is a little bit against us software vendor. I would say in general terms, I would say more sophisticated software technologies tend to make companies more fragile overall compared to cruder, simpler ways of organizing companies.
Well, Knut, to actually bring it back to risk and resilience, I remember in the survey from, I think it was November this year, you noted that of the three ingredients that were mentioned, visibility, master data, and demand planning, scenario demand planning, scenario demand planning was, or had the least adoption. I think it was only about a third of those surveyed said that they had effective demand scenario planning in place at the company. And I'm just curious, why do you think that there was a drop-off between the first two ingredients and the last one? And what effect does that have on resilience at the company?
So scenario planning is not easy. It sounds simple. You just say that, why don't you evaluate your overall end-to-end plan for the scenario that says we have less capacity, or we have higher demand, or the supplier is not able to deliver. But just imagine that a lot of companies still calculate one plan per week. So it's still the weekend is required because it takes 14 hours and it blocks a lot of the IT resources. So even in these days, 23, this often is the case. So how would you tell these companies that, hey, please calculate 5 scenarios where you evaluate different solutions, where they say, okay, that takes a week to calculate. So there's the sheer compute is often not there. Then there's very often, it's not clear how to populate the scenario. So what should we calculate and how to evaluate, right? So all of the planning solution providers have kind of the ability to calculate scenarios. And then you need to evaluate what is better for our current setup and for our customers and for our supply chain. So you need to be clear on, hey, should we optimize for service or for cost or for inventory? That's often not clear. So unfortunately, we still see a lot of s&op processes or IBP processes or end-to-end planning processes coming up only with one solution. And then the discussion is very interesting because you can only accept this one solution. There's no way that you can say, hey, why don't we do something different here? So there's a lot to catch up and to improve, to be able to calculate the scenarios, to understand and value the trade-offs, and then come to a joint decision, what is the best for our customers, our company, or our value chain.
Well, Joannes, I'll come to you for a moment. I'll come to you in a moment, because I know you'll have something to say about this. But just to follow up on that, Knut, we can't, the computational resources of any company will vary. But when it comes to evaluating the viability of any given scenario, do you see that as being unique to each company, or do you think that there is an overarching metric or philosophy that every company could use to evaluate the viability of a scenario?
So we always talk about the 3 most important elements of a supply chain, and that is cost, service, and capital. We'll probably start even with service. And then you have trade-offs. Service goes up. Oh, yes, we can do that if we increase inventory. or if we increase cost. Cost down, yes, okay, but then service might go down. So to understand these trade-offs is super, super important. And talking to a lot of our clients, we often do a very simple exercise. We just ask them individually, what is most important for you? Where would you invest, let's say, 10 euros to improve if you would have something, or 1,000 or 100,000? Is it reducing cost or optimizing cost? Is it improving service level, or is it reducing inventory? And you often get a completely mixed picture. So everyone talks about different things. So that means that the supply chain strategy is not aligned. If the supply chain strategy is not aligned, how would you evaluate what the best scenario is? Because one part of the company would go for higher service level. Often the producing part would go for lower cost because that's their local incentives. So that is something where you, in the bonus structure, if you look into the bonus structure, that is often contradicting these trade-off discussions of scenarios. So that is something that needs to be addressed, needs to be solved, and then you can decide on, hey, this is really the best solution for our company.
Well, thank you. And Joannes, your take on how to evaluate viability of scenarios?
I would revisit a few other things first, because you see, first let's discuss, about the compute requirements. We want that's something that I hear frequently. Oh, it takes hours to compute. But let's consider that a smartphone, just a regular smartphone, it does out of the box something like 10 to 20 billion operations per second, and that's a smartphone. If you get into a workstation, an actual workstation, we are very easily, cheaply, $2,000 or $3,000 into the 100 billion operation per second. If you're crazy and you go $5,000 and you put graphic cards and GPUs, you're into the 1,000 billions operations per second. Again, cheap stuff. So now the question is, what exactly are you doing of this processing power? Because you see, that's the thing, is that when Lokad, you see, we have the typical discussion I hear people say, oh, 5 scenarios takes 40 hours of compute. And then Lokad, we say, oh, but we just run about 1,000 scenarios a second. So, how come? So first, I would say, first, we have several problems. I mean, first, modern enterprise software has a problem of having layers upon layers that pile inefficiency. And people may not realize, but most enterprise software is built upon 40, sometimes 50 years worth of inefficient layers that never went away. And so you have you lose your processing power by a factor 1 million, sometimes more, in inefficiencies of having literally this sort of lasagna software design where it's a piece of software that talks to another piece of software that talks to another piece of software, et cetera, and it goes back and forth. So the bottom line is that first, if you, for example, try to do this sort of things with transactional systems, SQL database, it's going to be insanely inefficient. I mean, when I say insane, by a factor, something like anything between a factor at least 1,000 times slower than it should be, and possibly up to 1,000,000 times more slower than it should be. So supply chains as objects, for numerical simulations and whatnot, they are not like super complex. Even an incredibly complex supply chain is like 100 million SKUs, maybe 200 million SKUs. A modern video games is now simulating, real time about 1 billion triangle, 60 frames per second. So that just gives you the scale. So we are talking of something that, in terms of modern computes, even a gigantic supply chain, Walmart scale, is small. It's smaller than your average video games nowadays. So we have that to keep in mind. And so if you have calculation that takes more than minutes, you need to really pause and consider: am I doing something that is truly complicated, that really need all that processing power, or am I just starting from something that is incredibly inefficient? So my proposition is that most of the time we are talking of things that are incredibly inefficient. And that's, if you approach it the right way, it's a non-issue. Then the second thing is the operationality of scenarios. My approach, I mean, at Lokad, what I discovered that was a bit more than a decade ago, is that the problem with scenarios is that they are high maintenance. You know, if you have like a dozen scenarios that you want to maintain, it's a lot of efforts. And the trick, and it was literally kind of a trick, is that if you go for a probabilistic approach, where you look at all scenarios at once, and so that means potentially, you know, millions of scenarios, then if you have the right instruments, mathematical instruments and software instruments, it becomes a lot easier. And that's surprising because you would think, oh, if I look at all the possible futures at once, it has to be much more complicated. But the reality is that with the instruments, it is not. And the answer is because suddenly all the stuff that you want to consider becomes a lot more missable. You see, you don't have to make hard choices about what about the warehouse. Okay, let's say the warehouse at every given month, a 1% chance of being flooded or suffering something, you know, that would severely impact its operation. We don't need to know exactly what. We just say, okay, 1% chance a month that we will lose half of the capacity of the warehouse for whatever reason. A strike, a flood, an electrical problem, a small fire, and we can say 0.1% a chance that we lose the warehouse for 6 months. And you know, it's a guess. It's okay. And then the interesting thing is that you don't do that in isolation of the other stuff. You see, that the thing is that the beauty of the probabilistic approach is that you can say we add this risk to the warehouse, and then we will add the risk of having a port in China that is blocked. Again, 1% chance every month. You know, that's guesstimation. We can revisit that, but it's not. You see, the interesting thing is that you can suddenly parallelize the track, I would say the work track to think about those risks. It's not you craft a scenario where you decide exactly what are the risks taken into account and which one are not. Is that you can add a risk for the warehouse, you can add a risk for a port in China, you can ask a risk of surge of price for a supplier, and that's the beauty of it, is that all of that, you know, blend in. And in terms of maintenance, once you decide to include a risk, what is left to do? The answer is nothing, because your probabilistic forecast is embedding that, and the decisions that come out of the system are risk adjusted out of the box. So you see, and that's the big difference with, I would say, this sort of probabilistic perspective versus classical scenario planning, is that first, you can decouple entirely the way you analyze the different risks. So if you have different people that analyze different risks, they can, you know, play with the same system at the same time. And then once you get to an agreement about a level of risk, you immediately get risk-adjusted decisions out of it as soon as you turn it on. That's it, nothing to do. You have nothing to do. And that's the beauty of it, so that in terms of practicality, it's you think that inflation has like a 1% risk to be above 20%, you know, during the next 12 months. Okay, factor that in. And if people agree, then we have that, and we have immediately all the decisions that are risk-adjusted for that. And the interesting thing is that when you express things like that, yes, you may end up with, let's say, a couple of dozens of risk, you know, high level, but they are not very complicated to express, and they are not very complicated to maintain. And that's the beauty, is that it's much easier to maintain a high-level risk, such as 1% chance of 20% plus inflation over the next 12 months for, let's say, Germany, as opposed to maintain and craft a scenario where you would respond to this risk in specific ways and everything, because there you're doing the job twice or 3 times extra, like the what if you don't have the inflation and the what if you have inflation. The probabilistic approach is more like the quantum perspective, where we say, well, we look at all those possible futures and we let the mathematical instruments deal with those infrequent phenomenon, but that in aggregates are inevitable. You see, that the thing is that if you pile a series of 1% risk per month, you're guaranteed over the course of the next 5 years to hit several of those problems. The question just becomes when it will happen. One of them will happen. You don't know, but that's fine.
Well, Knut, does that align with your engineering understanding of the situation?
That is definitely in line, and it would be great to leverage this compute and to with this being able to have some kind of distributions of responses to discuss this, and to just one more example. Let's say you do this scenario simulations, right, and then you kind of know, hey, with this probability, this and this happens.
Mm-hmm.
What is then important is that companies need to be prepared to take levers. That is also kind of now you know that, oh, there might be a disruption.
Mm-hmm.
What is next? You need to understand, hey, here I need to have these 5 things in place, and just in case something happens with my early warning system, I would then start to execute, which is also what often is not necessarily done. So they're not really prepared, right? So even if there is the insight, they're not prepared to implement the solution.
I completely agree, and by the way, that's why in my series of lectures I introduce supply chain as the mastery of optionality. Mm-hmm. You need to cultivate options, and the interesting thing is that so scenarios are one way to make those options more pressing, such as simple way would be alternative transportation modes, but the problem is that it feels very theoretical until you hit the problem. And that was my problem with scenarios that was a decade ago was the due to the fact that a given scenario would not come into play, most of the time, this 1% chance, most of the time it doesn't come. And so there is no readiness for it because nothing in the system is really, plugged and geared toward the execution, the immediate execution of this scenario. But if you cultivate something where, for example, every single time you make a purchase order, there is the option to have it shipped by air freight at a much higher price, it's always an option that is there. It's just that usually it is not profitable. So the resolution of the system just end up with the conclusion that no, we pick the sea route. It's slower, but it's better. But you see, that's the difference between having the optimization that has the option that is already plugged in, just latent, not exploit, because the conditions are not right, versus, but it's there. And the minute it will becomes, a good option, it will be picked versus a scenario where the day where this option should come into play, it's something that is where nothing is really ready. The people are not used to that. The IT systems don't immediately respond to the proper decisions and whatnot. And so people have to think and do a lot of unusual things as opposed to just witness that the recommendation is just unusual due to the fact that the circumstances are unusual. You see, that's a little bit the different sort of taste. Same idea, but executed a little bit differently.
And let me give you an example from the recent years where we helped the client to be more resilient and kind of looked into scenarios, looked into early warning system and everything, and then found out that if there's something happening in one plant, we can produce in another plant. But there's one bottleneck resource that was the testing equipment. And the testing equipment, it required 12 weeks to move it from one plant to the other. So that means that you need to, in your scenarios, you need to decide 12 weeks before, hey, do we expect something and should we move? And it was completely new for them. They were always like looking into it like whatever 3 weeks before, and then, oh, it's too late. Yes, sure, you need to understand the solution space, so to say, the lead time to implement, and then only you can really have a good discussion.
I think that you're spot on, but for example, the case of testing equipment is very interesting because, in my leading question about risk, the problem is that people are frequently drowning into the mundane emergencies. So if you're already, struggling with late suppliers, price surges where you're struggling to renegotiate your contract with clients and all sorts of other problems that are complete distraction, that means that taking, for example, the point of saying, okay, we need to double invest and have like redundancy in the testing equipment, it's not going to be super efficient, but in the long run, over the course of, let's say, next 5 years, there will be a time where it will, save our quality of service. It's maybe not that expensive. I'm spinning. I don't have the details, But that's the sort of things that where people need time and calm, to ponder these sort of things. If they have to jump from one firefighting to the next, this sort of I would say, the sort of super strategic thinking just do not happen. I mean, that's kind of my perception.
Exactly, and let me just build on this. What I found also super interesting, super important is how do you tell this story that you just told, that hey, we need to have the testing equipment, we need to have a second one that requires investment. So all the kind of quarter end related KPIs will not look good, right? So the short-sighted managers will not look good. That is a decision of the board, right? And what we often try to explain is we use the analogy of an insurance. So you have a car insurance, you pay for your car insurance. If you would translate into this your kind of daily operations, you would say, why do I need to pay this car insurance? There's such a low probability that something will happen. Maybe you can just skip it, right? I don't need it. No, you want to have it in the rare case of an accident, because then it's getting really bad. And then the insurance comes in. And this is how we think about supply chain resilience. It is something that you develop just in case. It might require some investment, it might require some preparation, but then you're prepared in case it happens. And the challenge is that most companies think about the next quarter or the next year, but the next disruption might come in 1 year plus 1 month, right? So that is a strategic decision that needs to happen, and that needs to be decided by the board. And that's why to tell this story to the board is super, super important.
When you say telling stories, that almost sounds like leadership, almost like something that might feature in a leadership methodology, something that might feature in a book, perhaps.
That might be, exactly. So, and it's very nice to see a copy of the book even there. Right? That's amazing. Source to sold. And indeed, what we did, so my co-author and I, Radu Valamayo, and I, we did kind of talk about, like 2.5 years ago, we talked about that. Why do we not see more people with a supply chain background in boards, right? So as a CEO, also as a COO, why is that? Right, and we joked around, because it's probably that supply chain people speak a different language, right? They're so number driven, they're so detailed, they don't see the big picture. And we said that, on the other hand, supply chain people have a understanding end to end, so they should understand the business. And we said that let's look into whether we have examples. So we kind of looked into the Fortune 200, and there's only 11% of the companies where the CEO has a background in supply chain, right? Tim Cook being the well-known example, but there's clearly some more. And then we said that, hey, why don't we interview a couple of people who made it to the board with a supply chain background? And that then led to this 26 interviews, which is basically what we consolidated in the book, and then came up with kind of a condensed version of what we learned, which is the chain model, right? And it was very interesting. The interviews were great. We learned a lot from these people, very, very different careers. We had people from all over the world. We had men, we had women. To be also very clear, it was not so easy to find women, right? So here we are still kind of white male dominated, so that needs to change, very, very clear. We had entrepreneurs, we had kind of small companies, we had big companies. And that was very interesting. And indeed, the book receives very, very good feedback. And Radu and I talk a lot about it.
Well, out of curiosity, in the context of a discussion on risk and resilience, are there any of the interviews that strike you, other than your own thoughts, are there any interviews that strike you as containing insights relevant to the discussion that we're having now? And you can pick anyone, male or female, I won't mind.
So I would say literally everyone, because it was the time of the lockdown when we did the interviews, right? So literally everyone talked about the importance of being agile, being prepared, being resilient. And that's also what we put then into the chain model. So it's kind of abbreviations, and the A is for adaptable, right? So here, very, very important that we understand the risk, that we also are able then to communicate the risk to the board, and with this are prepared.
Sorry, actually, it just occurred to me. Could you actually just explain letter for letter chain? So it's collaborative, holistic, adaptable,
C for we need to be collaborative, and that is what we heard in a couple of the interviews. One of the contributors said that hey, they wanted to implement, or they were on implementing a new s&op process, and he came up with the crazy idea to integrate the supplier. So there were 3 suppliers that were really important, right? And everyone in the company was like, "Oh no, supplier, we cannot disclose our production plan to the supplier," right? So he pushed it through, and guess what? Everyone was very happy. The supplier was very happy. The company was very happy. So to build relationships internally, right, to connect the end-to-end value chain, but then also externally with customer and with suppliers is super, super important. The next one, holistic. So we need to understand the whole system, right? We need to understand the big picture. We need to understand what happens end to end. And this is something that is, I would say, in the nature of a supply chain person. It's not necessarily in the nature of some of the other functions where you're often more focused on what you do, like production does production, but does often not look into the impact of production on warehousing, distribution, customer, and also does not look into what happens with the suppliers, right? So here, this holistic topic is super, super important. Adaptable, A, we already talked about. The I in chain stands for influential. So here, I would say empower the people. Make sure that you empower all the people around you to be at their best and to contribute. And then the N, for me, the N is the most important part. The N is for narrative. And this is really, how do you explain? And to give you an example, so to say a negative example, if you think about how a supply chain person would explain an improvement in service level, right? You would say that, hey, our OTIF increased from 89.7% to 91.2%. And this does not necessarily tell a lot. If you would kind of use a more a narrative or a language that would be understood by the board, you might say that we improved our service level, and with this we were able to sell more, or the customer is more happy and coming back. So this is kind of using the right language, using the right narrative, and also the example I had earlier on the insurance to explain in simple words that the board also understands what we are doing and why it's so important to look into supply chain. We always say that, look, supply chain in the last 3 years got a seat at the table. And now, and everyone understood that, right? And now we need to make sure that we keep it. We keep that table, and we need to prove that we are worth to keep the table. Super important.
Well, thank you. Joannes, your thoughts?
And you see, the narrative, I think, the interesting thing is that the criticism kind of goes both ways, you see. And here I say, you see, yes, the supply chain director should be able to speak, the language of the board. But also, you see, the problem that I see is that, and again, it kind of boils down to the underlying software infrastructure that supports, the action of the supply chain director and whatnot. The sort of indicators that you find are usually incredibly narrow-sighted, like service level. For example, service level, if you're in a business where you have substitution, means nothing. If the client can still come to the store, and technically it's 50% of the stuff is absent, but there is tons of substitution and they just go for a substitute, as it can happen, for example, in fashion. It's largely nonsensical, and I can see very frequently there are metrics, KPI, especially those that are in percentages, that are easy to compute, but they don't really make much sense for the business overall. And so we have a problem where, you see, the supply chain director doesn't have a narrative or something that makes sense, because all the numbers that are being, engineered, cooked by his underlying infrastructure, people and software, are not quite completely sensical either. And it's very interesting. For example, when we come to clients, very frequently nobody had ever quantified in euros or dollars the quality of service in a way that really match even roughly the business. They would say, oh, we have service level. Say, okay, service level, super easy to compute, but does it reflect the perception? And just to give you an example, if again B2B retailer, I was saying that pass an order a month ahead. What is the difference between I walk into your store today and I do not find what I was expecting versus I passed an order 6 months ago, giving you 6 months of leeway to get the thing, and then discover that 6 months afterward you're still not prepared. You see, that in one case it's too bad, I was unlucky. In the other case, it's completely unacceptable, and that's amateurish. And so the problem with those, I would say, very naive indicators is that they tend to entirely miss not just the elephant, but the herd of elephants. It's very, very, very bad. And so I believe that your narrative, can be also an injunction into you need to engineer numbers that resonate more deeply with the business. I do not, it's not just about having numbers that are, usually those technical numbers do not resonate because they're plain bad. If you tell a number that is either we invest this 1 million euro in extra quality of service, or it will cost us 10 million euro of turnover per year cumulative for the next 5 years, so next year it will cost us 10 million, next year it will cost us 20, and after, etc., cumulative, then everybody would kind of get it. But usually the problem that I see, and here I believe that many of traditional supply chain practice are a little bit at fault with their supporting vendors, is that the sort of numbers that you get out of those practice plus their tools are percentages that are very nonsensical. It's like again, anything that is expressed as a percentage is, in my view, usually very deeply suspicious. If it's expressed in dollars, it's better. If it's expressed in dollars over dollars, it's even better. So in dollars is what I gain and what I lose. Dollars of dollars is per dollar that I invest or do not invest, what do I earn or lose? It's usually this sort of level to get a good metric. And that's why I think, those narratives usually, to lay the blame is that if all your instruments gives you kind of nonsensical numbers, it's very hard to build any kind of narrative that even makes sense business-wise, because you're operating on fluff, I would say. It's.
I like the push that kind of telling the right story needs also to have kind of the right KPIs in the first place. Mm-hmm. So what you're basically saying to my example, right? So that should be translated already, and not by the head of supply chain, so to say. That would be an ideal situation that then even the CEO can kind of lock into the system and already understand that, hey, by improving this and this and this, I will increase my revenue, right? So I fully agree. We are probably one step before that, but it's a great vision that you lay out.
Where I bouncing on the narrative idea is that very frequently what I see is that people generally, especially in supply chain, generally fear this sort of what I call second order effects. Things that are not in the books. Just to give you another example, whenever you have like discounts, in your brand, and at the end of the season, let's say your fashion, you do a discount. Then you have two problems. First, you give up your margin immediately, but then you create a bad habit in your customer base that expects the discount. So next year they will wait before they purchase until you give away again the same sort of discount. So you have a second order effect, which is the sort of long-term habits that your clientele develops. These sort of things can't be readily, quantified, because it's the sort of things that are, it's bad habits that develops over multiple years, potential decades. And luxury brands, for example, they never do any promotions just so that they don't let these sort of things, develop in the first place. But back to that, it means that you need to be able to have a KPI where part of your number, and that's where I think it kind of there is a problem with people that have too much of an engineering mindset, where part of your number is entirely made up, in the sense that you don't have like a mathematical proof or measurements to back it up. It doesn't mean that it's irrational, that is fake. It just means that it's more like a judgment call that can be very reasonable, but that needs to be made. And the example being that, what is the cost of a euro of discount given away today? Well, it will most likely cost me at least another euro of bad habits. Another euro, maybe two, maybe half, but clearly saying that it doesn't cost me anything in the future is just plain wrong. Then we can argue on exactly the scale of what would be, something reasonable. But back to that, I would say the sort of narrative forces you to have this long view and to factor numerically this sort of things, so that you can't end up with a decision deemed optimal, which is in fact incredibly short-sighted. And that's another sort of problem that I see, is that with those numbers, people are not imaginative enough. They don't take into account things that in the company, the broader company, people know, but due to the fact that it's kind of slightly elusive, slightly difficult to measure exactly, they would prefer ignore it entirely instead of having it like super rough, but at least present. You see, and again, I connect that with the narrative, that the narrative gives you kind of the guiding rails. If you go into a direction where you're doing something that doesn't make any sense, it's probably, even if the math looks correct, you're probably wrong at a deeper level or something more fundamental.
Well, it occurs to me, just to quickly respond to Joannes with a follow-up. I mean, so in Knut's example, when he was talking about providing narratives that make the concept of demand planning a little bit easier, so he used the example, the narrative of insurance. And Lokad does have narratives, like, for example, the basket perspective, that explains the idea of the interrelation and the additional cost of not having something when you need it. And that then enables people to understand the, as you said, the second order effects. So do you want to unpack maybe the basket perspective as the narrative that we tend to use to make that easier?
The thing is that as soon as we start having those factors that are not, I would say, real tangible numbers, that's what I call a second circle of economic drivers. Things that are very important but intangible, they won't appear in the book. For example, many companies have, let's say, penalties with their suppliers that they can exercise in theory. In practice, whenever they do, it's open war with the supplier and the trust is lost. So that is typically the sort of things where I say, well, the first circle is that, yes, you have a penalty. Second circle is that you can't use them, because if you do, you blow up a decade-long relationship with your supplier. And so the thing is, when you start optimizing, this insurance, the interesting things, again, that goes back to the probabilistic approach, is that you internalize the risk, and you internalize the risk on things that are never going to be measured. It requires a different sort of thinking. It requires people that have a certain taste in what is realistic, even if it's not real. Because that the thing is that when you deal in insurance, and especially if you have some sort of dynamic response mechanism, the funny thing is that many problems just do not happen because you proactively make them disappear. That becomes very strange. If you see, that's the thing, is that at Lokad, just to give you a taste, when we have those sort of system that runs automatically, it becomes a bit like a nice anti-spam system. It's humming gently, but you can go and look in the spam folder to look at all the junk that has been caught and eliminated, but the day-to-day experience is just, you don't see it. It just does its stuff. And that's, at some point, you might even wonder, do I really need this stuff? Because you see, it's it's just humming, and there are classes of problems that just don't happen. But as soon as you turn it off, the spam goes back, so the problems are back. So you see, that's, and again, it's, I believe that due to the fact that A/B testing is like super expensive, you can't just stop taking care of a class of risk to demonstrate to the whole organization what happens when you stop doing that and all the bad things that happen. You know, it's like a super costly way to do experiments. So in practice, it's not like super realistic. That's where I believe that this idea of developing narratives is very important, because it's a way to convey things that are very rational, but also technical. And you need to convey this message in a way that is very concise. People don't have the time to be experts in all those sort of risk and balance all of that and compute all the trade-off and make sure, you know, at some point they need to be able to trust you. But one way to earn this trust is to make sure that from the way you're explaining the problem, it really captures the essence of the business. You see, the narrative for me is very frequently a test of understanding. Is this person really looking at the problem from a perspective that kind of makes sense? Just to give an example, again, if we talk about, let's say, for example, aircraft maintenance, quality of service, one simple way to approach that is to think in terms of AOG, aircraft on ground. So per dollar invested, how many AOG per year do you avoid? That's, you know, that knowing that when an aircraft is grounded, passengers have to be rerouted, and it's a lot of delays, a lot of costs, knock-off effects on the flight schedule and whatnot. So if you think in terms of service level, you completely miss the plot, because an aircraft only need one part to be missing to not take off. So the relevant, I would say, event is the aircraft on ground problem, not the stock out, not et cetera, et cetera. So you see, it's and again, every business needs to have this sort of I would say insight that deeply resonate with what they're trying to do, as opposed to, I would say, easy metrics that happen to be, you know, available cheaply because it's prepackaged in the software, even if it's completely irrelevant to the problem at hand. I know I have this sort of software bias in my perspective.
What narrative do you have? Numbers. I love numbers.
Yeah, but the trick is that, you see, you would think that numbers are the opposition of narrative, but I would not say so. I would say, you see, it goes hand in hand. If you have a way to, you know, the narrative is the way you understand, even for yourself, the stuff that is going on. And that will completely shape the way you engineer your numbers. So don't think that the narrative is independent from the numbers. The narrative is literally the story you tell yourself to direct your work as a data scientist. So if you got this narrative wrong, it means that most likely you're doing complete garbage with your numbers. Again, the correctness is not in the mathematical, you know, aspect. I mean, it's usually the adequacy between, am I doing something where it connects adequately between the business and what I'm doing with those numbers. Yes, there is the factual error where you just multiply a number while you should be dividing, but that's a super technical error. And this sort of technical error usually are so immediately harmful, you know, to your calculation that they are easy to spot. I mean, if your numbers are off by a factor of 1 billion, okay, you have like a bland mistakes that you need to fix. This is an easy problem. The problems that are much more difficult is that when you're off in a subtle way, but always.
Agree. So the numbers clearly support your narrative, and it also supports everything that you then do to understand if something goes wrong, where you then kind of go into the details, right? So there's this 5 why thing where you kind of ask, and then you kind of go from the missing service, right? So the aircraft on ground, why is that? No availability. Why is that? Because we did not have stock. Why is that? Because we did not have a good contract with our supplier, and so on and so on. And then you find the root cause, and then you can solve that, right?
Any form of leadership, or whatever narrative you want to propose for leadership, even the chain model, whatever, is still, effective leadership is still predicated upon having people with the necessary skills to activate the vision expressed through whatever narrative you please. So Knut, to come full circle again, 3 years removed, what do you see now as the critical skill people need in supply chain?
So I could now repeat the chain model. Let's not do that. So you need to have all of these skills. And again, all of us, if I would think about what would be a wish for all of us is that everyone in supply chain that understands all of these kind of end-to-end thing and so on should make sure that you kind of train colleagues from supply chain and from other areas, that you make sure that you increase the level of capability, that you make sure that you increase the pipeline, so to say, right? So Joannes and I are teaching at universities for exactly this reason, to teach practical supply chain. And with this, increase the community. And with this, spread the word and make it super clear that supply chain is a super interesting topic. And it's also opening up the path to the board, right? So there's often people that ask, but if I'm in supply chain, that maybe that's a dead end, right? No, it's not. Kind of, it's the topic that was one of the most important over the last 3 years and will be going forward.
Oh, I'm very much aligned. I think in terms of skills, there is probably one, if I had to mention only one, it's not programming, it's clear writing.
Ah, yeah.
And because you see, all of that, the idea of collaboration, your large company, it's distributed, so it's going to be in writing most of the time. Yes, you can have meetups, but most of the time it's going to be in writing. You want to have a narrative, again, it's going to be in writing. You want to organize your reports and whatnot, again in writing. And one of the quality that I think is probably the most underappreciated in I would say modern corporation, especially in supply chain, less in other departments like marketing, is clear writing. And very frequently I see that it's that the quality of writing in those departments, generally speaking, is very low. And so you have like you have very confused summaries about problems, very unclear problem statements. Even when people, I mean, just a litmus test, when people are, please, in writing, give me a half a page description of your job position and why it exists in the first place. Usually the outcome is, when I do the sort of litmus test, is absolutely terrible. And that's a big problem. And I think that there are some industries or verticals, or functions where people have been cultivating for a long time clear writing. Finance is one, where usually it's very concise, to the point. Marketing is another one, out of necessity. If you want to have a good branding, you need to be able to convey things clearly and concisely. There are some industries like software that are very much written. And so I would say on average, compared to other industries, that the quality of writing is quite good, let's say compared to, let's say, manufacturing, for example. But overall, I think for students, writing is still, I would say, for many students, a weak skill. Especially that can be improved. I mean, during the course of the life, it's not like out of university you're done. It's something that you can learn, afterward as well.
As is customary on Lokad TV, Knut will give you the last word. Is there anything you want to mention?
The audience should buy the book.
Available on Amazon.
There's if you still need a Christmas present, the book is available. It's available on Amazon and others, and make sure to buy a copy. Make sure to spread the word, right? So to spread the word of, hey, supply chain is cool, and build the network.
All right. Well, on that note, Joannes, thank you for your time. Knut, thank you very much for yours. And thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.